Thanks for joining us. I'm Endy Zemenides, the Executive Director of the Hellenic American Leadership Council and a proud partner of the Delphi Economic Forum. Thrilled to be chairing this discussion on America's future in the Middle East and to welcome panelists who have worked with the Delphi Economic Forum. Actually, these have been our hosts for the Delphi Economic Forum in DC, so it was only fair to bring them over to Delphi. They also have been some of the best oracles on the US policy in the Middle East, starting with Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations, Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute and the Middle East Forum, and Jonathan Schanzer of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. America's future in the Middle East. And of course, this looked way different a few months ago. And not to taunt anybody, but in September, the National Security Advisor had this famous foreign affairs article. And of course, only if you have it in print can you see what he said, because it's already been corrected online. He said, the Middle East has never been so stable. What did Washington not see to make this? I was going to ask you, has that prediction aged well? Clearly it hasn't. But what did they not see to get it so wrong?
It's a good question. I think the quote was, the Middle East hasn't been as stable as it is now for decades, or it's more stable today than it has been in the last 2 decades, was I think the exact quote, which, as you quite rightly point out, Endy, is only now available in the print edition of the November-December issue of 2023 issue of Foreign Affairs online that's been scrubbed. I think, there is some reason, that for Jake Sullivan to have said that. The Abraham Accords were proceeding, and there was talk, obviously, of the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The end of the civil war in Yemen seemed to be on the horizon. There was, with much, I think, relief, but I think misreading in March of 2023 when Iran and Saudi Arabia reestablished diplomatic relations. There were a range of issues that I think that the administration looked at and said, here are examples of a more stable region. There were problems: Syria, Iraq instability, the Palestinian issue. These were all those seen as back burner issues that didn't have easy resolutions and were not part of this kind of new engagement with the Middle East, which included the India-Middle East economic corridor, all the things that the administration really wanted to focus on and emphasize as policy wins. What it was missing, though, and I think principally what the administration was missing, because there was a certain blinders about the role of Iran in the region, and that the idea that Iran wanted a new relationship with the United States, and with just enough diplomatic exertion, we could bring them back into the JCPOA, and we could start anew again where President Trump had taken the United States out. And I think all the events since would suggest quite clearly, and events even at the time suggested quite clearly, that the Iranians were not interested in a new relationship with the United States, but interested in sowing chaos in the region, and in the process pushing the United States out of the region. The Iranians clearly have had a hand in October 7th. There is obviously an axis of resistance with varying degrees of autonomy from the Iranians, but Hamas has been very clear in thanking the Iranians for their support in this. And then, of course, besides the Iran issue, there were very significant problems in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which quite clearly exploded on October 7th. So I think in the effort to accentuate the good and to maintain the idea that the Iranians wanted a new relationship, the administration didn't look more deeply into what the Iranian strategy was in the region, nor what was happening in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And we're living with the consequences of that.
If I can... I do, but I want to add one more layer to you as you're getting there. He talked about Iran. We've also seen this administration, and most of them were in the Obama administration too, back during the Arab uprisings, the Obama administration wanted Turkey to play a role in the Sunni world. Can you add an analysis of Turkey to where he talked about Iran?
Well, basically, to conceptualize, I largely agree with Stephen, but to conceptualize where I think the United States across administrations gets things wrong, there's two problems, and I'll bring Turkey into this. The first is we tend to like to look at the conflicts in the region, especially terrorism, through the lens of grievance. If you're a diplomat, addressing grievance can be comforting because that means there's a magic formula that if only you find the right balance of incentives and so forth, that the terrorism will go away. But that discounts the important role of ideology. I'm not saying that terrorism is either or, either grievance, poverty, lack of education, lack of prospects, or it's ideology. There's a spectrum there. But we tend to completely ignore the importance of ideology. The other thing we consistently ignore, and this is where Turkey comes into play alongside Iran, is the agency of other states. And we Americans look at history in snippets of 2 or 4, or at most ancient history is 10 years old. And we tend to forget that many of these countries have their own agendas, which they are pursuing, irregardless of Washington's navel-gazing. Now, when it comes to Turkey, as with Iran, ideology is absolutely crucial to understand. And again, Americans tend to project our own well-being, our own points of view onto others, and that leads to blind spots. So when we see Recep Tayyip Erdogan, we don't necessarily see Recep Tayyip Erdogan the ideologue, we see Recep Tayyip Erdogan the politician. But what I always do when I lecture to other audiences, to understand the importance of ideology and how Turkey has changed. And a statistic from the Turkish Interior Ministry is that since Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power, the murder rate of women in Turkey has increased 1,400%. And that's because of the sense of religious impunity, especially among the more conservative constituents of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And when it comes to his own agency and how he changes Turkey, and there's the old joke about, one of these Turkish intellectuals does the wrong tweet and gets sentenced to 20 years in prison. And he goes into the prison library. He's got a lot of time with a whole list of books he wants to take out. and the prison librarian looks over the list and says, "I'm so sorry, we don't have any of these books. We only have the authors." And the fact of the matter is that there is a fundamental transformation underway, which we can remain blind to. Just in short, I can no longer go to Turkey for the same reasons that Henri Barkey can't go into Turkey, and those reasons, of course, is Endy gets us into trouble. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that too many people spend time in the central historical districts of Istanbul. When I would be a Turkey analyst, I would always spend my time in Sultanbeyli, which is, a large slum area, and it gives a completely different picture of where Turkey's going. Turkey, I think, in the 21st century, and this is where ideology and agency come together, is to extremism what Saudi Arabia was in the 20th century.
John, as a Hamas expert, you've been overwhelmed the last several months, constantly having to talk about this. And the reason I want to point out the Hamas expert, and going back to Iran, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal was supposed to be this reset. One of the reasons I was critical, and several people here were critical of it, is that it took support for Hamas off the table. They didn't care. And in fact, a lot of the funds that were unlocked, funding Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, how bad was that in terms of a strategic oversight, given that we see Houthis, now we see Hezbollah? The big concern is a war to the north of Israel with Hezbollah. And can that be fixed in a new order?
Well, first of all, great to be with everybody here. Look, the 2013 JPOA, the interim deal that gave Iran roughly $100 million a month in cash followed by the JCPOA, the 2015 finalized nuclear deal that gave Iran about $150 billion in cash, was just a monumental mistake by the United States and the other world powers. The P5+1 should have known better. What they ended up doing is they bargained with themselves. They reasoned that by giving Iran this money that they would buy moderation from the regime, that they would buy compromise over the nuclear program. But of course, this was only temporary compromise. We knew that there were sunset clauses within the deal that would soon expire. And it was basically, we agreed with ourselves that we were doing the right thing and everybody else went along with it. That money undeniably flowed to the coffers of the Houthis, Hezbollah, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and Hamas. We can see it across the board. And so what we've done is we've funded this war. I mean, plain and simple, this is what the United States has done. We have actually handed the money over to the Iranians and then it flowed down to these proxies and now they're fighting us today. I would, by the way, also argue that while we did that, we also decided to turn a blind eye to the Qataris and the Turks as they were giving assistance and cash to Hamas. And for whatever reason, I mean, and I to this day don't understand why we did not sanction these countries as state sponsors of terrorism, why we did not hold them to account for this, because it was a matter of time before things began to explode. From a financial perspective, from an illicit finance perspective, this was a bill that was going to come due. And we should have known better, and it was an attempt to kick the can down the road. But as we now can see, that only lasts for so long before things begin to blow up.
Could I actually toot Jonathan's horn, because he won't do it himself? It's just very brief. After 9/11, President Bush issued an executive order enabling the Treasury Department, in which Jonathan used to work, to designate basically groups and individuals involved in terrorism. And if you actually compare almost 25 years on, that Treasury Department list with the State Department list, I think the Treasury Department list is about 30 times as long, simply because the Treasury Department list is very objective in its criteria, whereas the State Department list has always been subjective.
Let me just underline one other point. It's not that the United States didn't know that this was going to happen, and it's not that folks in Washington were saying it happened. Our partners in the Gulf were saying that precisely the problem with the JCPOA was, from their perspective, not necessarily the nuclear issue, was the relief that the Iranians were going to get in terms of billions of dollars in their coffer. In fact, I heard one fairly senior Gulf official say, look, if the Iranians are after a nuclear weapon, we'll buy them one. Just don't give them hundreds of millions of dollars, because they will use that money to create chaos around the region.
So the second part, and this is to all of you, the second part that I asked John is, can we put that genie back in the bottle? Because Hezbollah has already captured the state of Lebanon. The Houthis, and the Saudis are not having war with them anymore, so it looks like the Houthis are going to be the new Hezbollah, or the Hezbollah in Yemen. Hamas, I mean, I know everybody says we got to get rid of Hamas. I'm not sure what they're doing to get rid of Hamas. Can that genie be put back in the bottle? Jonathan, start with you.
Yes and no. I mean, it's a great question, and really what you're asking is what's the solution to the current problem? And you've got to look at each front right now, and just to be clear.
I'm actually asking, I'm actually asking, are we going to let these people become state actors?
Right.
Rather, they were terrorists when you designated them.
Right.
Are we going to allow them to be state actors?
And they are, right, if you're asking about Hamas,
yeah.
There's no state and there's no government,
yeah.
right? I mean, the Israelis have taken care of that problem for now, but then you're going to have the problem of the reconstruction of Gaza, which is going to be a monumental task. It's going to be billions and billions of dollars to try to reconstruct this. But I think when you look at each of Iran's proxies around the region and the damage that's been done, the threats that have manifested over the last 6 months, I think we need to take each one of these fronts one at a time. Hamas can be contained and be held at bay if we allow the Israelis to actually defeat them, and then to build something in its place with international assistance. The Houthis can be also deterred, destroyed. This is not a formidable military force at the end of the day. Sure, they've got some ballistic missiles and they've got, I think, a fairly formidable arsenal, but they can be defeated quite easily. And by the way, I would also suggest that it's shocking to me that the United States has not done more to contain this threat, given that it's something like 12% of maritime trade that's been shut down by the Houthis. The Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria are also very defeatable. But I think we've got two outstanding challenges right now that I think no one is prepared to tackle. The first is, what are we going to do about Hezbollah? They have a force that is equal in power to a mid-sized European country with 200,000 rockets and precision-guided munitions and all sorts of other advanced weaponry. And they do control the state, exactly as you suggest. So that, to me, that portends a full-blown clash with Israel. And I think that is quite possible moving forward. But then there's the broader question, which is the Iranians themselves. For the last week, everyone's been watching the Iranians threatening to respond to Israel's attack on basically the man who was in charge at the IRGC of controlling all of these different proxy groups around the region. The Israelis took him out, and now the Iranians are saying that they're going to attack Israel directly. We don't have a credible threat to the Iranians right now. They are not deterred. They don't feel as if they have any reason to be fearful of the United States or of the international community. And so the question really is, when you talk about putting the genie back in the bottle, my question is, can we contain the Iranians? Can we actually deter them? Can we defeat them? Do we have the will to do that? And I would say that right now, this current administration in Washington and this current constellation of European leaders, I'm not convinced. But I do think that from a capacity perspective, sure, the answer is easy. Of course we can.
Okay. Let me approach this a different way. First of all, there's a conceit in Washington that we can make as many mistakes as we make and that they don't have consequence. We always have a blank slate. And obviously that's untrue. That said, there's a few other issues I would say. When it comes to Iran, which of course is, if you will, the head of the octopus, Iran is nearing a transition. And it's unclear how that transition will go as the supreme leader turns 85 this coming week. And look, he's had cancer twice. He's partially paralyzed from an 81 assassination attempt. What's going to happen after Khamenei? That's unclear. And things could go in any number of different directions. You could have regime collapse, but with the existence of the Revolutionary Guard, I'm not sure whether that will actually happen. There's nothing that says that the supreme leadership has to be a single person. It could be a council. And then you have the dynamics of what that factionalization would mean. Remember, after Osama bin Laden was killed, Zawahiri was appointed, but you had all the various upstarts want to try to sponsor spectacular terrorist attacks to make their name and to rise through the ranks. Could we see a dynamic like that? If I want to look at the silver lining in Iran, Iran has an indigenous history of democracy back 110 years ago during their constitutional revolution. And it's the only successful, if you will, democratic period in Iran. And it was marked by not having any single charismatic figure. And therefore, when we look at the woman life freedom movement, there was no single charismatic figure. Now, is it possible to deter Iran? I believe yes. I spent about a decade teaching for the US Navy. And whenever I would ask chiefs of naval operations, admirals, or retired admirals, what military posture should the United States take to make Iran take our diplomacy seriously? The answer was, take our aircraft carriers out of the Persian Gulf and put them 600 kilometers off the coast of Iran in the northern Indian Ocean. And that may seem counterintuitive, but the Persian Gulf is very narrow and it's very shallow. I think at its deepest point, it's only 100 meters deep. And therefore, as with the Bab el-Mandab and other strategic choke points, It's vulnerable to surface-to-ship missiles. It's vulnerable to mines. It's vulnerable to drones and so forth. If we were to move our ships, and if Europe were willing to move their ships 600 kilometers off into the northern Indian Ocean, every single Iranian worth their salt would see that and realize that we could strike them and they couldn't strike us. To have successful diplomacy, it's not simply about talking. It's about setting the stage for successful diplomacy and convincing the Iranians there's something worse to come. I do believe that maximum pressure works, and another conceit of US politics is that somehow every strategy has to conform to the American political calendar. But I can name 2 periods of time when maximum pressure actually worked. What would it take to release the American hostages that were seized in 1979? And what would it take to end the Iran-Iraq war? Now, in 1979, Khomeini issued a great series of demands. And in 1981, after Reagan came in and the hostages were released, the Council on Foreign Relations published a book of former Carter administration officials which argued that it was the persistence of diplomacy which led to the release of the hostages. The late, great Peter Rodman wrote in the Washington Quarterly that this was actually backwards. It was the rising cost of Iran's isolation, especially against the backdrop of the Iran-Iraq war, that led Khomeini to realize he had to compromise. Then, from declassified Iranian documents, we know that in 1982, that Ayatollah Khomeini was willing to end the Iran-Iraq war because they had driven most of the Iraqis out of Iranian territory. And the Revolutionary Guard came and said, no, we've got to continue this fight until we not only drive Saddam Hussein out of power, but until we liberate Al-Quds, Jerusalem. Again, ideology at play. War persisted for another 6 years. Another 500,000 people were killed. And finally, it became too great to bear. Khomeini got on the radio, and I'm quoting, he said, "It's like drinking from a chalice of poison, but I have no choice but to drink from this cup if I want the revolution to survive." The question then becomes for policymakers, how do we force the Iranian government to drink from a chalice of poison and recognize that their survival means not engaging in some of these malign behaviors? The last point I would say is during COVID, I took advantage of the low airfares, and I spent a lot of time in southern Lebanon, in Nabatea, which is Hezbollah Central. It was at a time when Hezbollah had changed its payment of its fighters from US dollars to Lebanese pounds. You might as well be paying them in old newspapers. They had changed, the supermarkets had stopped with the subsidized goods for Hezbollah, and Hezbollah was estimating that they had lost 90% of their fighters who were in it for the money as opposed to the ideology. And again, I go back to where we were before, that we can't simply look at this as grievance-based, that we have to recognize that you peel off the people that aren't truly committed, and then you kill the ones that are. Is it possible to eradicate Hamas? I hear so many people say, look, Hamas is a fact of life. They've controlled the Gaza Strip for 17 years. Well, gosh darn, we should have preserved the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia because they were an ideological movement. They controlled territory. But you know what? Military force managed to defeat them. And Osama bin Laden once said, you know, everyone loves a strong horse. They don't tie themselves to the hobbled pony. To defeat these proxy groups, what you need to do is define yourself as a strong horse. We're defining ourselves as a senile old pony. It's Morocco. And sorry. And then with the Houthis, I'll also say this. We get ourselves into a box. Perhaps Yemeni unity is the problem. And I spent a lot of time in Yemen. I used to live there. And South Yemen is stable. It's completely tribally, clan, culturally, historically different from North Yemen. But if you simply worked with some of the clans along the Red Sea, Hudaydah, Mocha, and so forth, and gave them some strategic autonomy, suddenly the Houthis are back in the mountains and we don't have some of the dangers we have now. But I've rabbited on long enough. Stephen.
Stephen.
Yeah, let me just bring it back to your question,
Yeah.
Endy, since Michael's given us the tour of his tour of the region.
Stephen took us to the Straits of Malacca.
It strikes me, your question, are we going to allow these groups to be state actors? Yeah. I think the question really lies on where Americans and where the debate in Washington is going about America's role in the world. And for the last 30 years, Washington pursued its goals in the region in a way that we lost a sense of what was actually important to the United States in the region. We became extraordinarily ambitious in an effort to transform the Middle East, and the return on the investment was essentially nothing. When it comes to the challenges today, the overlearning the lessons of those 30 years of trying to transform the Middle East confuses people about what's important. So that when we look at a kind of global core interest of the United States, freedom of navigation, and the fact that the Houthis are trying to block freedom of navigation in an extraordinarily important waterway, 12 to 15% of trade goes through the Red Sea. Egypt is in part dependent upon Suez Canal tolls. Forcing vessels to go around Africa leads to stress on supply chains, increased prices, more greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, all kinds of knock-on effects as a result of it. Yet the suggestion, when people make it in Washington, that the United States should take robust action to ensure freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, those people are accused of warmongering, neoconservatives who are intent on transforming the region, which is not actually the case. This is a purely important core interest of the United States. We have lost what is important to us. Allowing a group like Hamas or Hezbollah is a state actor. Allowing the Houthis become a state actor and giving them and the Iranians leverage over global trade like that undermines a core interest in the United States. And because we have been mired in this morass of ambition and transformation of the region that we now want to pull back, where there's been this debate, we have to leave the region, withdraw from the region, it leaves us in a place where we don't actually have a clear understanding of what's important to us. And I'm focusing on the Red Sea because it is actually something that is crucially important to us, along with its twin, the free flow of energy resources out of the region. And if we let groups destabilize the Arabian Peninsula like this, we're going to have problems with both. That's my short answer to a longer 15 minutes here. Why don't we move on to the next question?
I actually think it's related to this question because you guys, we just talked about who we don't want to be part of it. If we're going to leave the Middle East, or if the U.S. wants to pivot away, we have to worry about what comes after, right? And that's what we saw with the Abraham Accords and the Negev Forum, this constellation of actors that had the blessing of Washington, D.C. Now there's a debate. The follow-up issue to Jake Sullivan's issue, there was all kinds of debate, what's the future order? And somebody said, you know, there was one argument, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which, by the way, was not convincing. But I'd like to get each of your take. Who is Washington going to rely on, right? Is Abraham Accord, or something like the Abraham Accords, actually more like the Negev Forum, which I thought was picking up steam, and right before October 7th, let's remember Congress wanted to look at Greece and Cyprus joining the Negev Forum. So who is the U.S. going to look to for a new order? I'm not asking what that new order is. Who is it going to look to? Who is it going to be really suspicious of?
Well, look, I don't think that there's a tremendous amount of change to that. First of all, I think the idea that the United States is going to pivot from the region or withdraw from the region, I think there's a way to remain in the region without the kinds of excesses that we have seen over the previous 30 years. But the United States has been able to exercise its power in the region with a regional order made up of Israel, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Bahrainis, and several others. Those are the obvious candidates in whatever the new order, whatever it looks like, will be. There are questions about some of our other traditional partners, the Turks, for example. The Jordanians have been particularly irresponsible over the course of the last 6 months. We know that the Qataris have also had their problems and have played it at both ends of the stick. But those are the obvious candidates here. This kind of grand idea that we would have this JCPOA and it would And it was the fundamental hunch at the heart of the JCPOA is that it would lead to a new relationship with the Iranians. And that, I think, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. And so I think going forward, we're going to have a similar kind of rivalry in the Gulf of status quo powers versus the Iranians, who are not a status quo power, and their axis of resistance.
Very briefly. I mean, we can talk about other partners, and I worry about some of those that the Americans are tempted to rely on, like the Turks and the Qataris. But what we also need to do is be mindful of how our rhetoric is seen in the region, because when we talk about a pivot to Asia, and there's every logical reason to pivot to Asia, what people in the region, especially in the Gulf, understand is their own historical experience of the British with the whole East of Suez speech. And so when we say pivot to Asia, what everyone in the region hears is a pivot away from us. And then if the Americans aren't a reliable partner, and you add into this Afghanistan and everything like that with the withdrawal, then even if we don't like the Iranians, even if we don't like some of these other forces, we need to sort of make our compromises with them irregardless of the United States. I worry about what Russia is doing in the region. I'm a little bit more sanguine about China, simply because when we hear fancy things about $25 billion or 25-year deals between China and Iran, you got to look at the details. A, they're not there, and B, the Revolutionary Guard's never going to give up their economic monopolies. But put it this way, when a vacuum is formed in the region, it's not the forces of altruism which fill it.
Look, the way I look at it is there are three different axes in the region right now. The first is, of course, what the Iranians call the axis of resistance. This is Lebanon, it's Syria, it's Iran itself, and these are the malign forces that need to be countered. And I think we can all agree on that. Then there are the spent forces in the region. And here I'm referring to the countries that once upon a time were the centers of gravity in the Middle East. Egypt, Jordan, right? These are the old regimes that once had power and that at this point, I mean, are bankrupt financially and I think politically as well. And you can see that with these former powers. I'm worried actually about the future of Egypt and Jordan and a few other states in the region. Then there is the Islamist countries that have emerged within the region. They have a very different vision. It's a Sunni Islamist view. And here we're talking about the Turks, right? One of the world's leading sponsors of terrorism that also happens to be in NATO, and I don't understand the logic of that. But the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, I think I would also throw in there. They are, a harmful factor in most of what goes on in the region. And when you look at these three different axes, there is only one answer to them, and that is Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, Bahrain maybe, although they're a lot weaker than the others. And then that raises the question of what are we going to do about it? I mean, number one, we need to be pushing the Saudis and the Israelis to join forces, just as the Israelis have done with the UAE and Bahrain. We need to forge a new alliance structure in the region. And I would say that right now we're at a pivotal moment. Because if the Israelis right now in their battle with Iran and its multiple proxies are not successful, well, then this alliance will not be forged. These are, I remember writing about the Gulf states and their decision to go into the Iraq War, not to go into the Iraq War back in 2003. And the title that was given to me at our old shop, the Washington Institute, was Survival of the Skittish. These are countries that are not exactly profiles in courage. They are watching to see whether the United States is ready to step up, and they're waiting to see whether the Israelis win in their battles right now across the region. If the Israelis emerge victorious, and if the United States shows some backbone here that we are choosing this alliance structure, that we're betting on it, I see a future that is viable in the region. Those other three axes, if they come out on top, we're in a lot of trouble.
So we only have 2 minutes, but I want to just, and it's going to be just a quick answer from each one of you. You talked about a new order. I just saw the U.S. ambassador to Cyprus. We know the role that Cyprus is playing right now in Gaza and all the rest. Does this new order, is one of our problems, and Steve, you have a new book that's upcoming in June, there's your commercial, talking about a regional strategy. Is the new order in the Middle East, does it have to be, to work, does it have to be beyond defined as just Middle East? You three have worked on the term Eastern Mediterranean before anybody did in Washington, D.C. Does it have to be an Eastern Mediterranean strategy? Or what is a new order to work? How should it be branded?
I mean, absolutely. I would say that East Med and MENA, if we have this alliance structure that I just talked about, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Israelis, and the Greeks and the Cypriots coming together for the good and stability of the region, we've got, I think, the right combination. You start to remove those or weaken that structure, I think, we're headed down the wrong path. But I absolutely see this part of the world as crucial to the stability of that other part of the region.
The Sixth Fleet used to be something you'd sail through on the way to the Fifth Fleet. It's now the center of gravity, and I think that's for the good.
Yes.
Yes.
Said be quickly. Look, I think what we've seen over the course of the last number of years in the Eastern Mediterranean, when the Turks were particularly aggressive in their blue homeland strategy, the bandwagoning of all of these states, the Israelis, the Cypriots, the Greeks, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, all coming together to meet that challenge would suggest that Greece and Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean play an important role in a region that's broadly defined. I think, for bureaucratic purposes, the U.S. ambassador is here, so she knows better than anybody. Bureaucratic purposes, we chop up the world in very specific ways, and sometimes it doesn't make sense, but across bureaucratic lines, people don't always talk to each other as well as they should. I think the kind of blurring of those bureaucratic lines within the United States would more easily reflect how important these two regions actually connect to each other and relate to each other.
Thank you all. You can continue this conversation with these three by listening to them and Thano on the Greek Current podcast.
There's your
with
commercial.
Kati Merini, and keep getting Michael Rubin in trouble in Turkey. Thank you.